And there we go. So the portion this week in Eitz Chaim, page 660, is the portion Metzora, which begins with chapter 14 of Leviticus. So whatever Chumash you're using, you want to turn to Leviticus 14. And again, in the Eitz Chaim, it's page 660. So we continue the subject that we began last week, which in a non-leap year, these two portions would have been combined. And in many ways, it would have been a lot better if they were combined, because the subject matter is really, it's difficult, it's hard to relate to, and some parts of it are graphic and gross. So, all right, let me say the bracha first. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So, when we imagine the Torah, when we think about the Torah, if we were like to give a definition, kind of like the what some people call the elevator speech, like how you can explain something in as long as it takes to ride an elevator. That's the idea of an elevator speech. So like, why are you a rabbi? What I can answer, or explain Judaism to me, or what is the meaning? What is the Torah? So if we were to explain to somebody what the Torah is, I think the number one thing is the basis for everything we do as Jews today. Okay, and beyond that, it is the story of the Jewish people, the history of the Jewish people, and our relationship with God. It is the origin of the Ten Commandments and all of the how we run our society in an ethical, moral, and religious way. So all those things are what Torah is. We wouldn't imagine then that the Torah would waste its time in such like behind closed doors kind of things that happen, right? These two portions, this week's and last week's, are not exactly portions that are meant to be talked about in public, right? These are things that happen in the privacy of our own home that should remain our business, not anybody else's business, right? So those stand-up comedians talk about stuff like this, the most graphic of them, and but most of the time, issues like this are not talked about in public, right? In polite society, you don't talk about this stuff that you would have to take care of in the bathroom. You don't talk about in public. So what's the Torah doing talking about it? So I think there's a powerful message that everything in life, from the most disgusting and private to the most spiritual and holy, are appropriate to discuss and to put into a religious framework. Okay, so I think there's an important message there that this Torah portion and last week's Torah portion teaches us. The other thing would be, and I mentioned this on Shabbat in the introduction to the Torah reading, that there are also things that are just unexplained about our bodies and things that are beyond our control, right? Like if you get a cut if you cut yourself, you put some antibiotic cream on it and you put a Band-Aid on it and you're going to get better. It's not a problem, right? There are things like that. You have a broken arm, you can get it reset, put a cast on it. So things like that today, which by the way, in the time of the Torah, were life-threatening experiences. You break your arm, you get a cut, they could be deadly. If the bone isn't set the right way, there could be an infection. If the cut on your body could get infected as well, and etc. So those little things, which we take for granted that we can control, were not in control. And then there are still things in life today, medically, that we're not in control over. Right. And so Jan also wrote, there's also the statement from Hillel, which is the opposite of what's later in the book of Leviticus. Love your neighbor as you would be loved, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, or Hillel taught what is hateful to you, do not to do to others, are essential statements of the Torah. Yes, so that's another way to understand that the Torah provides an opportunity or a guidelines for how to relate to other people in the world. But back to the subject matter of Tazria and Metzora, so illnesses, there are things in life that happen to our bodies that we have no control over, even today. Cancer, COVID-19, other things like that. And so when something happens to us that we don't have control over, we then panic and are stressed and have no idea where to turn. Okay, so the irony is, the more that we have control over our life, when something happens to upend that control, the more we are upset. Okay, and so we take for granted that we are able to find cures for things and control things. And so when we can't, that's when we get most upset. So perhaps Tazria and Metzora is also a response to what to do when something bizarre happens to our body that we can't explain. That there is a framework within which we can work that will help ground us and maintain our equilibrium as we navigate this bizarre stuff happening to our bodies. Okay, so in some ways, for example, when a death occurs, right, no matter how old the person that we are mourning dies, the grieving is deep and profound. And depending on the circumstances of the death, it could throw us for a loop, and it could leave us with not knowing where to turn to next. And so within the Jewish tradition, there are rituals that the mourner performs to help the mourner know there's something to do next. There's something to get up in the morning for, to pray the service, to say Kaddish. There's something to do now. Here's the funeral service. Here's the ribbon to tear. Here's Shiva, the 7 weeks. You don't have to worry about eating because people are bringing food to you, etc. So Jewish rituals and other religious traditions have their rituals as well, help ground the person and steer the person in the right direction with the right support. So mourning rituals in Judaism help ground us, and these rituals that are described in last week's portion, Tazria, and this week's portion, Metzora, also help ground the person. That here a bizarre thing is happening, and none other than the Kohen himself is coming to your house to check you out. Okay, so the person who you see in the sanctuary, taking care of sacrifices, is also coming to your house to look after you and to provide you something to do ritually. And then there's the mikveh to go to once the rash starts going away. And then there's an offering to bring to thank God that that this rash has disappeared or has gotten to the point where it's not an issue anymore, right? So I think there's something powerful about that as well, with the portion, with this Torah portion, and why it's here in the Torah. And then there's also how the rabbis understand it too, because the skin rashes described, and then also later in this portion, the home that could be afflicted with a similar kind of rash, which we'll get to in a little bit, are just so bizarre and unexplainable to the rabbis that they have to come up with some kind of homiletic interpretation of it. So if we just look at the beginning of the portion on 660, we'll get a sense of how the rabbis understand this. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moses saying, Zot tihiyeh Torat HaMetzora. This will be the law or the ritual for the person afflicted with this skin ailment. Okay, it says here leper, but it's not leprosy as we know it. I think it's just easier for the translation of our Chumash, the Jewish Publication Society translation, just to say leper, but it's not leprosy as we know it. Okay, so it's some kind of skin rash. This is the ritual for the person afflicted with a skin rash, biyom taharato, on the day that he will be purified, vehuva el hakohen, and when he is brought to the kohen. So the word Metzora was seen by the rabbis. Well, let me step back one moment. So again, the rabbis are seeing these skin ailments as strange. I'm not sure how common they were in rabbinic times. I think just because of unsanitary conditions that people were living in more than 75, 80 years ago, right? So from ancient times until about 80 years ago, many people lived in unsanitary conditions, right? And so when was penicillin discovered? Maybe 100 years ago, maybe less. So let's say before the discovery of penicillin, then unsanitary conditions could lead to boils on your body and scabs and things like that, things that might take a while to go away just because you didn't have any kind of ointment to put on it, no antibiotic cream. So some of these rashes might not have been so unusual, but for the rabbis, it was still, why would somebody be afflicted with this, right? So maybe there's a religious or moral lesson that the Torah is trying to teach. So the rabbis say, if you look at the second line on 660 in the Hebrew, for the word for the person who is a leper, Metzora, Mem Tzadi Reish Ayin, if you see that there in the middle of the line, Mem Tzadi Reish Ayin, the rabbis see the term as an abbreviation for three Hebrew words. So the Mem Tzadi reminds the rabbis of the word motzi, as in hamotzi lechem min haaretz, brings forth. So motzi, and then a word that is missing from these letters is shem, which means name, and then the last two letters being ra, bad. So motzi shem ra is what they say Metzora stands for, someone who brings out a bad name, which is someone who is a talebearer or a gossiper. So for the rabbis, they are teaching an extra lesson that the Torah is not necessarily teaching, and that is someone who gossips is someone who will be afflicted with this kind of skin rash. And so then the rabbis then go on to teach how, and let me say this, the reason why they do this is because in the book of Numbers, in the portion Beha'alotecha, I believe, Miriam, Moses' sister, yes, and Aaron said, we're talking about Moses' wife and saying bad things about her. And then if so, keep your finger here and let's turn to chapter 12 of the book of Numbers, page 833. And we'll see the brief story there, how the rabbis make the connection. 833, chapter 12 of the book of Numbers. When they were in Chatzerot, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. Quote, he married a Cushite woman. Okay, we probably talked about this last year when we talked about the portion Beha'alotecha. We'll get there again. Excuse me. So they're talking about Moses' wife. They said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? The Lord heard it. Now Moses was a very humble man, more so than any other man on earth. Suddenly the Lord called to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. So the three of them went out. The Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, stopped at the entrance of the tent, and called out Aaron and Miriam. The two of them came forward, and he said, hear these my words. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He's trusted throughout my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses? Still incensed with them, the Lord departed. As the cloud withdrew from the tent, there was Miriam stricken with snow white scales, Metzora in the Hebrew, which is the feminine of Metzora. So as a result of speaking this way with her brother Aaron about Moses, their brother, God punishes Miriam with these snow white scales, with Metzorat kashaleg. She has this, she's broken out in this skin rash like snow. And so, why did Miriam become afflicted? Because of her gossiping with Aaron about Moses. Now, the bigger question is, why isn't Aaron afflicted? But that's a question for when we get to the portion Beha'alotecha. So, we come to this bizarre skin rash. This story here, chapter 14 of Leviticus, connects to the rabbis with Moses, Aaron, and Miriam in Numbers chapter 12. She's afflicted because of gossip. Maybe everybody's afflicted because of gossip. And Metzora then can be a reminder we're supposed to think of Motzi Shem Ra. Anybody who gossips is going to be afflicted with this. So better not to gossip and then be spared from this affliction. There is a rabbi from the 1800s known as the Chafetz Chaim who wrote an entire treatise about gossip. And in some Hasidic communities, the idea of gossip is taught a lot and is emphasized a lot to ensure that people do not engage in any kind of bad speech. It's not just, it's not like gathering around the water cooler. Did you hear what I heard? That kind of speech. It's a variety of. There's a whole book on different kinds of gossiping and what the different categories are. So for the rabbis then, we understand this not just as of how to react to the uncontrollable in life. It's not just providing us with rituals when something bad happens to our bodies, but it's also this spiritual lesson about behavior, and that this bizarre physical thing will happen to us as a result of speech, which the only physical component to speech is moving the lips and making sound come out of our mouth. But once the speech comes out of our mouth, you can't see it, you can't feel it, but it has an effect. And so the speech that comes out that you can't see will have a physical effect on your body. So that's how this is how the rabbis then transform this portion into these bigger issues. So any thoughts or questions about this before we look below the line on 660?
Well, what other diseases are mentioned in the Torah? I can't really think of any.
There aren't. The Torah mentions later in the book of Leviticus what kinds of afflictions to the body would disqualify a Kohen from working in the sanctuary. So there are physical ailments that are listed there, but there are no other diseases that the Torah talks about.
Well, I know people didn't live that long, even though it said they lived over 100 years. It was probably a timing. So a lot of people died before they could develop the kind of diseases we have now. But there were people with birth defects and things like that.
Right.
And we read about when they left Egypt, there were a lot of people that were stragglers because they were sick.
Right. But the Torah does not specify what kind of ailments they have. You know, the rabbis do talk, though, when you mention birth defects, the rabbis do talk about, and if we're following the Daf Yomi cycle, some of this is mentioned. Hermaphrodite, androgynous people. So people who are born, men who are born with both sexual organs of both men and women, people who are born with no sexual organs. So the rabbis know about such people, and they come up in conversation in terms of people to marry. You know, what if you marry a person like this? What kind of marriage is that? And also whether such a person with both sexual organs or neither sexual organs, can they be counted in a minyan? Are they a man or are they a woman? And are they obligated to observe the commandments? So these unusual human beings are discussed by the rabbis. They're not discussed in the Torah or anywhere in the Bible. Eunuchs, though, are mentioned in the Bible, but those are people, you're not born that way. But they are mentioned as part of the courts of the kings of Israel, and also they're mentioned in the book of Esther as well. They're the Sarisim, the eunuchs in King Ahasuerus's court. So anyway, it is interesting to think about these unusual afflictions. So let's look below the line on 660. This parsha, read together with Tazria in most non-leap years, this is a leap year, we had an extra month of Adar that was added, describes the ritual of purifying and reintegrating the recovered leper. We can read it as a description of the Israelites' attitude to the experience of recovering from illness, right? So this commentary is suggesting, don't just read it about leprosy, read it as a more metaphorical term of how one can recover from any kind of illness. The text also discusses the appearance of a plague in the stones of a person's house and the implications of menstrual blood and seminal emissions as they relate to ritual impurity. The formal description of the cleansing ritual masks the deep and possibly conflicted feelings of the person who has recovered from a serious illness. These might include feelings of relief and happiness, together with a new appreciation of good health, perhaps resentment over what had been gone through, as well as envy of people who had remained healthy. So a variety of feelings that a person afflicted could be feeling about that affliction. The offering of the recovered leper is sometimes referred to as the sacrifice of one who has returned from the dead, either because the illness was so grave or because a life cut off from all human contact, a life without friends and family, was not really a life. Part of the 7 days of recovery is that you have to be set aside from the camp. You have to be outside the camp. And so that sense of isolation takes you away from community, takes you away from family, and is very disconcerting. And so the ceremony for recovery, it's not just personal recovery, but recovery of your place in the community, is similar, can be called the sacrifice of one who has returned from the dead, because some of the rituals related to it are similar to purification from contact with the dead, that you are sprinkled with both a branch of a cedar tree and also a branch from a hyssop bush. So there's Eitz Erez ve'ezov, so the cedar wood and hyssop. So there's commentary about that on verse 4, number 4 below the line. The offering included cedar wood from the tallest and strongest of all plants. That is, in the Middle East, the cedar tree is like the redwood of America. Okay, so the cedar of Lebanon is considered to be the tallest tree that anybody in the Middle East has ever seen. Okay, so you have the cedar, the tallest and strongest of all plants, and hyssop, which is a kind of grass, the smallest and most vulnerable of all growing things. So you have the tallest and the smallest combined in this ritual. This was to symbolize the leveling power of illness, which afflicts the powerful and the powerless alike, and to teach the mighty a lesson about their vulnerability. The person recovered from illness may re-enter the camp, but may not go home yet. Perhaps one who leaves the hospital or the isolation of serious illness with great relief is not yet fully oneself, not quite ready to resume the routines and responsibilities of normal life, home, and family. So perhaps trying to add modern thinking to the rituals here, trying to getting a psychological sense that it makes sense. And some people have commented about the grieving and mourning Jewish practices that seem to be psychologically make sense, that we, over the course of the year of mourning for a parent, one leaves stages of varying degrees of intensity of mourning, from hearing the news of the death first, then the funeral, then the 7 days, then the rest of the 30 days, and then the rest of the year are different degrees of mourning and grief. And the initial days through the first week, you're not supposed to leave your house. People are supposed to come to you to kind of respond psychologically to what you're going through, that you can't imagine being part of the world yet, and then slowly transitioning back into the world. So some of the rituals here as well, that this strange thing happened to your body, it threw you for a loop, and how to slowly reintegrate back into the community. Okay, let's look for a moment just at this other bizarre thing that would happen with a house. On page 664. Actually, it starts at the very bottom of 663. Chapter 14, beginning with verse 33, is a new topic. So at the very bottom of 663, if we turn there, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon lemor. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Ki tavohu el eretz Canaan, when you enter the land of Canaan, asher ani noten lachem la'achuzah, which I'm giving to you as a possession, v'natati negat sarat beveit eretz achuzatchem, that I will put a plague of tsarat, this rash, in a house. Now it's translated as an eruptive plague upon a house in the land that you possess. So the thing is, so what is it? Uva asher lo habayit, and the one who has such a house, v'higid la kohen lemor, he would tell the kohen saying, Kenega near Ali babayit. It looks like a plague in my house. So something that would look like mold on your wall, but more than that, I mean, you get mold on your drywall if water comes into contact with your drywall. But this is houses back in Torah days were not made with drywall. They're made with stones. So how could a stone wall that perhaps maybe had plaster over it, still, it's stone-based, earth-based substances. What kind of plague are they seeing? And this is such a bizarre thing. Why would a house have such a plague? Okay, so that's the question. And so below the line has a little bit of commentary about it. So the appearance of tsarat in the stones of a house was a mysterious event. Some sages doubted it ever happened, and others consigned it to a distant past. Right? So the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud said, well, this is so bizarre, and maybe just here to teach us a lesson, because it never happened. And they say this about a couple of things in the Torah, like later in the book of Deuteronomy, there's the question of the rebellious child. So the rabbi said that never was. And so they'll say this about this here as well. So the one response is it never happened and it never would happen, but it's here to teach a lesson, or it's something that happened long ago, it doesn't happen again. So that's one first. Commentators consider the afflicted house to be a moral warning rather than a natural occurrence, even more emphatically than they consider cases of skin disease to be a moral warning. All right, so the skin disease is one person and they live outside the camp. The house is more prominent, more public, and you see this house. And what has to be done to this house as the Torah goes on, if the plague doesn't go away, the house has to be destroyed, and the stones just left there as rubble, as a sign to others in the community. Okay, so the house itself that's not cured of this rash serves as a sign to others. So what is it? To be a moral warning. They fasten on the word for I inflict, because it says vinatati, God says I will give or I will put, to deduce that this was a plague sent by God. A home is a family's private refuge. Thus, a home afflicted by plague represents the breakdown of the social values that kept the family safe and united. So that's what the rabbis are saying. Something's going on in this house to have it afflicted with this plague. And so the only way to cure the family of this ailment is to attack the house and to have this physical thing happen to their house that could maybe help them start over again. It was a cause for concern that the problems of society at large had come to infect the home. Most commentators suggest that the antisocial behavior that brought the plague to the house was selfishness, a blindness to the needs of others, right? Because part of the destruction of the house, you would see the possessions that were inside the house. You have to take your possessions out before the house is destroyed. So the rabbis say this is a stingy person who would be afflicted with this plague in their house. And you'd see, this stingy person who never gave to charity, look at all the possessions that this person had that they could have afforded to give to charity, and they chose not to. So that this was a punishment for the stingy. So it's just ways for the rabbis to make sense of something that was so bizarre and why it would be here to teach us. Okay. Any questions or comments about this?
I have a general question
Go
about
ahead, Saul.
Leviticus that I always wanted to know, not about this particular one.
Yeah.
And all the rituals, what goes with all the blood and sprinkling blood and all that? It doesn't seem natural.
Right. So I think that the way that I understand it is that the whole, and I think this is part of the introduction to the book of Leviticus in the Eitz Chaim, which we looked at a few weeks ago. I think that part of the whole sacrificial system, to understand it, is a compromise from God to Israelite society based on what other societies were doing at the time. So by that I mean, the only form of worship that people knew about 3,000 years ago was offering sacrifices. So to create a whole new system that would be so different would make it radical and perhaps impossible for the people to follow, because people are base their practice on what other people are doing around them, right? So it's kind of hard to be a minority in a majority population when you're doing something that is completely different from everybody else. Okay, so, like Ash Wednesday, all the people who are walking around with an ash cross on their forehead, if that was a Jewish thing to do, there wouldn't be that many Jews doing it, because Jews are the minority. And why would a Jew walk around with something like that in greater society when you'd be looked upon by everybody else? But if greater society is doing it, because everybody has the ash cross on it, then it's not a big deal. So I think that that's part of what these rituals are all about, the whole sacrificial system. Everybody else is doing it. So here's our unique approach to doing it. Okay, so we're not sacrificing to a variety of pagan gods. We're sacrificing to one God, where perhaps maybe sacrifices in other systems, in idolatrous systems, might cause pain and suffering to the animal. Maybe the animal isn't put to death immediately before sacrifice. Here, we are killing the animal right away to alleviate any pain and suffering to the animal in this process. And perhaps also some of the meanings behind the sacrifices. What are they responding to? What human emotion, what human actions are they responding to, are also uniquely Israelite, uniquely Jewish. So I think that for me, I understand it in its historical context. The sacrificial system itself is meaningless to me. It's archaic to me, but the reasons for doing them are the same reasons for why we pray. And so for that, I think they have universal eternal messages. So that's how I understand it. It's unique. It's in its historical context. The whole system makes sense. And here in the Torah, we have the religious meaning behind the sacrifices.
So what are the real from Jews thinking about when they say we'll eventually go back to we'll build a temple and we'll do these sacrifices? I mean, it's a historical thing. I mean, doesn't make sense today because nobody's doing it that way.
Right, but for the from those who are davening from a traditional prayer book, so modern Orthodox all the way to the ultra Orthodox, do pray for the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem and the restoration of the sacrificial system. So I think some of the more modern of the Orthodox will admit that, well, it's not likely to happen in my lifetime, so it's okay for me to pray this for some time in the future. And if I were to merit being alive in that time, the Orthodox would say, well, God would make it right. And maybe God would come down and say, we don't need sacrifices anymore. We can just keep on praying. It's possible that some in the Orthodox world would say it that way. But others would say, no. We are this, if it's in the Torah, then it's meant to be an eternal form of worship. And our prayer system is just a temporary substitute, a 2,000 years so far, temporary substitute for the ideal form of worship, which is sacrifice. So the ultra-Orthodox would say the sacrificial system that we read in the Torah is the way to do it because God commanded it. Who are we to question? If we have a problem with it, it's our problem. So we just need to do it because God commanded it. So that's what they, I don't look forward to that day of bringing sacrifices, and I would hope that if that day were ever to come, that we wouldn't be slaughtering animals in order to worship God. Any other questions or comments? All right, so we'll stop here for today. Next Wednesday is the Wednesday before Passover, but we will have our Torah study as usual that Wednesday morning. The following Wednesday is during Passover. I think that will be okay. I know my daughters will be home for all of Passover, but I think let's say just wait for an email if we don't have class during Passover, but we will meet next Wednesday. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.